You can't force an avoidant person to come closer, but you can become the one thing they never run from. And most people completely misunderstand what that actually is. It's not beauty, not intensity, not chasing harder or loving louder. In fact, all of that often pushes them further away. What pulls them in and keeps them there is something far quieter, far rarer, and far more psychologically powerful than desire itself. It is the kind of presence that feels safe enough to stay near, but free enough not to feel trapped. And once you understand this, everything you thought you knew about attraction starts to change. You might assume that attraction is always driven by obvious desire, chemistry, sparks, intensity, and that magnetic pull that makes everything feel alive and immediate. But when it comes to someone with avoidant tendencies, that surface-level idea of attraction doesn't hold nearly as much power as most people believe. Physical desire alone fades quickly for them, and in many cases, it never reaches the deeper layers where real attachment is formed. Because what actually captures an avoidant person is not loud, not obvious, and not performative. It is psychological. It is subtle. It operates beneath awareness, bypassing the defenses they've spent years building. And once you understand this shift, you stop trying to force connection through effort or intensity, and instead begin to embody a presence that naturally draws them in without pressure. One of the strongest forces that impacts avoidance more than physical attraction is emotional self-sufficiency. But not the exaggerated, performative kind where someone pretends they don't need anyone. It is something far quieter and more grounded. It is the steady state of a person who is comfortable within themselves, whether someone is present or absent. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to emotional dependence. They don't just notice it, they feel it immediately. The moment they sense that someone is relying on them to stabilize their emotions, validate their worth, or fill an internal void, their system begins to withdraw. It's not a conscious decision at first. It is a reflex built from a deep need to preserve personal space and autonomy. However, when they encounter someone who is emotionally complete on their own, someone who enjoys connection but does not depend on it for stability, something unexpected happens internally. That kind of wholeness doesn't create pressure, it creates safety. It communicates, without words, I am here because I choose to be, not because I need you to hold me together. And paradoxically, that is exactly what makes them feel more comfortable leaning in. Not because they suddenly crave closeness, but because closeness no longer feels like something that will consume or trap them. Another powerful element that bypasses desire and reaches deeper than physical attraction is emotional restraint paired with depth. Many people misinterpret emotional restraint as a lack of interest or emotional distance, but avoidant individuals perceive it differently. They are not drawn to emotional excess or constant expression. Instead, they are drawn to what feels contained, intentional, and internally rich. When emotions are not constantly displayed but clearly felt beneath the surface, it creates a sense of mystery that the avoidant mind cannot ignore. They begin to sense that there is more happening than what is being shown, and that gap between what is visible and what is felt becomes mentally stimulating. Curiosity begins to form quietly in the background, and curiosity, in many cases, is far more powerful than passion. Passion burns quickly, often intensely but briefly. Curiosity lingers. It keeps the mind engaged long after the moment has passed. When they cannot fully read you, when they cannot immediately categorize you or predict your emotional reactions, their imagination steps in to fill the gaps. And in that space of uncertainty, attachment starts to develop slowly and almost invisibly. Even deeper than curiosity is consistency without emotional pressure. Avoidant individuals are often conditioned to expect emotional intensity to come with demands, expectations, or sudden shifts in boundaries. In most experiences, closeness increases pressure, and pressure leads to withdrawal. So they remain guarded, always anticipating emotional escalation. But when they encounter someone who remains steady, someone who does not fluctuate emotionally to get attention, someone who does not use closeness as leverage, someone who stays grounded regardless of external responses, their nervous system begins to settle. The environment no longer feels unpredictable or threatening. Predictability in this context is not boring to them, it is regulating. It removes the sense of emotional threat that they are constantly scanning for. Instead of preparing to pull away, their system starts to soften. They don't feel pushed, cornered, or emotionally pursued. They simply experience presence without pressure. And over time, that combination, emotional self-sufficiency, quiet depth, restrained expression, and steady consistency, creates a kind of attraction that is not driven by urgency or intensity, but by safety and curiosity working together. It doesn't force connection. It allows it to form naturally, at a pace their nervous system can actually tolerate. This is the layer of attraction most people miss completely, not because it is complicated, but because it is quiet. And in that quiet, something far more lasting than desire begins to take shape. Lust can create excitement, even intensity in the moment, but steadiness has a completely different effect. It settles the nervous system, and for someone who has lived much of their emotional life bracing for unpredictability, that calm can feel far more compelling than any spike of desire. Stability doesn't just soothe them, it begins to register as something they don't often experience, safety without pressure. There is also something quietly powerful about being seen without feeling exposed. It becomes an understated form of connection that often outweighs physical attraction. Avoidant individuals tend to fear being fully known, because being fully known can feel like losing control of what they reveal and when they reveal it. But when someone observes them with care, picking up on patterns, moods, and silences, without demanding explanations or forcing emotional disclosure, it creates a different kind of intimacy, one that doesn't invade their space, yet still understands it. Lust seeks access. It pushes for closeness, urgency, and immediacy. But this kind of presence offers acceptance instead, and acceptance feels far safer to an avoidant person than desire ever could. Desire can feel like pressure. Acceptance feels like permission to exist without having to defend every emotional layer. Respecting distance is another dynamic that is often misunderstood. Many people interpret space as rejection and respond by trying to close the gap, often with urgency or emotional pressure. But avoidant individuals experience distance differently. For them, space is regulation. It is how they regain internal balance. When someone allows that distance without resentment, without guilt, and without emotional manipulation, it disrupts their usual expectations. They are accustomed to distance creating tension, conflict, or pursuit. So when space is met with calm neutrality instead of reaction, it becomes disarming in the most subtle way. Instead of pushing them further away, it creates relief. And in that relief, they begin to drift closer on their own. Grounded confidence also plays a deeper role than most realize. Avoidant individuals are constantly, often unconsciously, scanning for emotional dynamics that feel like pressure or dependency. When someone seeks reassurance too often, or leans on them for emotional stability, it creates a subtle sense of responsibility they instinctively resist. But when they encounter someone who holds themselves with quiet confidence, someone who does not rely on external validation, who does not need emotional anchoring from the other person, they take notice. That kind of presence signals self-possession. It shows that you are not trying to be completed, fixed, or defined by the connection. You are choosing it, not clinging to it. And that autonomy is deeply compelling to someone who fears being emotionally responsible for another person's stability. Emotional neutrality during moments of conflict is another often overlooked factor. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to escalation. Raised voices, emotional flooding, or unpredictable reactions tend to trigger withdrawal almost immediately. But calm, intentional communication, where needs are expressed clearly without overwhelm or emotional chaos, allows them to stay present instead of retreating. Over time, it is not intensity that builds connection for them, but presence. A steady, regulated presence creates the conditions where trust can form gradually, without triggering their defenses. There is also something magnetic about a life that feels full, textured, and independent. Avoidant individuals are often turned off by over-availability, or by a dynamic where one person's entire world revolves around the relationship. When someone has a life that feels meaningful outside of the connection, it sends a very different signal. It communicates that the relationship is an addition, not a dependency. There is no hidden demand for it to become the center of everything, and that absence of pressure makes space for attraction to develop naturally, not through pursuit, but through curiosity. And then there is emotional honesty without expectation. When someone shares what they feel without attaching demands to it, without requiring reassurance, validation, or immediate resolution, it creates a rare kind of emotional experience for an avoidant person. They are often conditioned to expect that emotional expression will come with obligation, that feelings will need to be managed, fixed, or absorbed. But when honesty is offered freely, without pressure, it disrupts that expectation. It shows that emotions can exist without becoming a demand on the other person. And in that rare space, where honesty is present but not intrusive, where closeness exists without pressure, where connection does not erase autonomy, something deeper than attraction begins to form. Not urgency, not obsession, but a quiet pull built on safety, respect, and curiosity that unfolds over time. Closeness without cost is where the deeper layer of understanding truly begins. It is not about forcing intimacy, accelerating connection, or trying to extract emotional proximity through effort or intensity. It is about allowing closeness to exist in its own form, without pressure, without expectation, and without emotional demand attached to it. Lust, in comparison, rarely reaches this layer in any meaningful way. It can create stimulation, attraction, even temporary fixation, but it does not touch the deeper structure of how someone with avoidant tendencies processes emotional connection and safety. What actually challenges them is something far quieter and far more precise: honesty that carries no hidden agenda. When emotional truth is expressed without any embedded expectation for a specific response, behavior, or reassurance, it changes the entire emotional equation. It introduces reality without turning that reality into obligation. There is no invisible pressure behind the words, no emotional debt being created, just clarity. And for someone who is constantly alert to subtle forms of emotional demand, that distinction matters more than most people realize. Clear, calm boundaries, held firmly, consistently, and without punishment or emotional retaliation, create an entirely different psychological environment. They signal structure without threat. They communicate that you are not emotionally unstable, not reactive, and not willing to abandon yourself in order to maintain proximity. Avoidant individuals tend to respond more to this kind of grounded limitation than to emotional persuasion, pleading, or attempts to negotiate closeness through intensity. When you are able to assert yourself without anger, without escalation, and without withdrawing affection as a form of control, something becomes immediately visible: self-respect that does not depend on dominance or approval. You are not trying to manage their behavior, and you are not collapsing your own emotional boundaries to keep them close. You are simply remaining consistent with who you are. That balance, quiet, steady, and unforced, creates a form of attraction that is not based on pursuit, but on respect. And respect, in these dynamics, often carries more weight than desire. Intentional silence is another layer that is frequently misunderstood. This is not silence used as punishment, avoidance, or emotional withdrawal. It is not distance designed to provoke reaction or regain control. It is a grounded, comfortable silence that exists without tension. The ability to sit in shared space without filling it with reassurance-seeking, over-explaining, or emotional performance signals something deeply regulating to an avoidant nervous system. Lust tends to demand constant stimulation, engagement, and feedback. It thrives on reaction, escalation, and visible emotional exchange. Silence, however, introduces something fundamentally different: peace. And for a nervous system that is often hyper-attuned to emotional intensity or unpredictability, Peace is not neutral, it is impactful. It does not activate defense mechanisms. It allows them to settle, to observe, and to exist without internal urgency. And in that absence of pressure, curiosity begins to form naturally, without being forced. Perhaps the most significant shift occurs when the internal need to influence, secure, or manage their response disappears entirely. When you are no longer operating from a place of trying to be chosen, validated, or emotionally anchored by their reaction, the entire relational structure changes. Avoidant individuals are not simply drawn to intensity, they are drawn to emotional sovereignty, but only when it is real, not performed. When someone is self-contained, emotionally steady, and internally anchored, they are no longer perceived as a source of pressure. They are no longer someone who needs to be managed, soothed, or emotionally monitored. Instead, they become someone who can exist beside them without overwhelming their internal system. That is a rare experience for someone who is constantly scanning for emotional demand, even in subtle forms. In that state, connection no longer feels like obligation. It no longer feels like a situation where closeness automatically comes with cost. Instead, it becomes something optional, something that can unfold at a pace that does not trigger internal alarm. And when connection feels optional rather than imposed, it becomes significantly safer to explore. Desire alone cannot create this effect. Physical attraction may initiate interest, but it does not bypass emotional defenses that are rooted in autonomy protection. What does bypass those defenses is psychological safety, created through consistency, emotional clarity, and the absence of pressure. Presence, when it is calm and unforced, becomes more impactful than intensity ever could. What is often misunderstood is the assumption that avoidant individuals are indifferent to deep attraction. They are not. They are highly sensitive to it. The difference is that their system filters experiences through the lens of pressure versus safety. Anything that feels like expectation, emotional obligation, or potential loss of autonomy can activate withdrawal, even if there is genuine interest present. But when they are met with steadiness instead of volatility, clarity instead of confusion, and respect for space instead of pursuit, their defenses are not activated in the same way. They are no longer interpreting the connection as something that threatens their independence or overwhelms their emotional capacity. Instead, what begins to emerge is a much quieter emotional response, one that develops slowly over time. Relief becomes present first, because the absence of pressure is immediately noticeable. Curiosity follows, because the dynamic does not fit their usual expectations and cannot be easily categorized. And then fascination begins to form, because there is depth without intrusion, presence without demand, and connection without emotional captivity. These emotional states, relief, curiosity, fascination, are often far more enduring than intensity. Intensity burns quickly, it creates peaks, but it rarely creates stability. These quieter states, however, linger. They build gradually, shaping attachment in a way that is not driven by urgency, but by familiarity and safety. Understanding this dynamic is not about learning how to manipulate emotional responses or engineer attachment. It is about recognizing how emotional safety, autonomy, and pressure-free presence influence the way connection develops for someone whose internal system is constantly scanning for threat, even in subtle relational cues. Avoidant individuals respond less to what is demanded of them and more to how they feel in someone's presence over time. That feeling determines whether they move closer or withdraw. Not intensity, not pursuit, not emotional escalation, but the internal sense of whether connection feels safe enough to remain within. And when what they consistently feel is steadiness instead of volatility, respect instead of pressure, and emotional space without abandonment, something gradually shifts. Not into chaos or urgency, but into a slower, more stable form of attachment. One that is built not on emotional spikes, but on psychological safety that accumulates over time. That is the kind of connection that does not rely on intensity to survive. It does not fade when excitement lowers. It does not collapse when novelty disappears. Instead, It deepens quietly, grounded in trust, familiarity, and the absence of emotional threat. And in many cases, that is precisely what allows it to endure long after desire alone would have naturally faded. In the end, what this entire understanding points to is not a strategy for chasing someone, and not a set of behaviors designed to provoke a reaction. It is a deeper recognition of how connection actually forms beneath the surface of intensity, desire, and emotional pursuit. With avoidant tendencies, attraction does not disappear. It simply operates under different conditions. Conditions that are shaped less by passion and more by perception, safety, and internal emotional experience. What most people misinterpret as disinterest is often not absence, but protection. A protective system that prioritizes autonomy over intensity and emotional safety over emotional escalation. Because of this, what sustains connection is rarely what is loud, urgent, or forceful. It is what is steady, grounded, and emotionally regulated. Across everything discussed, a clear and consistent pattern begins to emerge. Pressure does not create closeness, it disrupts it. It activates resistance, triggers withdrawal, and pushes distance where connection was intended. In contrast, calm presence does the opposite. It creates space for someone to remain without feeling emotionally cornered. Demand, even when subtle, builds internal distance, while emotional clarity and steadiness open the door for curiosity to form naturally. Intensity may capture attention in the beginning, but it is consistency that allows attention to deepen into something more stable. And closeness only becomes truly sustainable when it does not feel like it comes at the expense of identity, independence, or emotional equilibrium. This is where emotional self-sufficiency, quiet confidence, and internal grounding become so significant in these dynamics. Not because they function as techniques or strategies to influence someone, but because they fundamentally change the emotional atmosphere of the interaction. When there is no underlying neediness, no urgency for validation, and no hidden expectation of being completed by another person, the relational field becomes lighter and less pressured. What remains is presence that does not demand anything in return, and that kind of presence is rare enough to stand out on its own, without needing to be exaggerated or performed. But perhaps the most important realization is that none of this is about control or guaranteed outcomes. It is not about creating attachment through calculated behavior or ensuring someone stays through emotional positioning. Instead, it is about understanding the conditions under which connection can exist without triggering defensive responses. Individuals with avoidant tendencies are not absent of emotional capacity. They are highly responsive to the emotional environment around them. They naturally distance themselves from what feels consuming, overwhelming, or restrictive, and they are more likely to remain present in spaces that feel safe, steady, and non-intrusive. In that environment, something different begins to develop over time. It is not the volatility of obsession or the instability of emotional highs and lows. It is something quieter, more gradual, and more enduring. Tension slowly gives way to relief because there is no pressure to perform or react. Confusion softens into curiosity because the experience does not fit old patterns or expectations. And eventually, distance is replaced not by force, but by familiarity, something that builds naturally through repeated experiences of safety. What ultimately lasts is not attraction in its most intense form, but the emotional experience surrounding it. It is the feeling of being with someone who does not impose, does not overwhelm, and does not create emotional urgency. Someone whose presence remains steady even when uncertainty arises. Someone who does not threaten autonomy, but instead respects it fully, while still allowing connection to exist. And in the long run, it is this emotional safety, quiet, consistent, and unforced, that becomes the foundation of something far more stable than intensity alone could ever sustain. The deepest form of connection is not created through pursuit. It is created through regulation, of self, of emotion, and of expectation. When you embody that steadiness consistently, you stop becoming something that needs to be chased, decoded, or escaped from. You simply become a presence that feels safe to return to. And that is why, long after intensity fades and desire quiets down, it is not passion that remains the strongest force. It is calm, it is respect, it is emotional safety, and it is the quiet, enduring sense of peace that makes connection not only possible, but sustainable.